Welcome everyone to the February 2021 edition of the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club podcast. The Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum is dedicated to the promotion, education, and dissemination of pre-hospital research. We believe that it is the responsibility of emergency medical professionals worldwide to build a body of evidence to examine pre-hospital emergency care. Here with the PCRF Journal Club, we take a closer look at some of the latest research happening in EMS. I'm Remley Crow, and today I'm joined by Dave Page, Dr. Tony Fernandez, Dr. Bill Toon, and Jeff Rollman. And it is my great pleasure to welcome the first author of this paper, pre-hospital research legend and leader of the flock, Dr. Paul Pepe. As a reminder, the name of the article we're going to be reviewing today is Rationale and Strategies for Development of an Optimal Bundle of Management for Cardiac Arrest, which was published in Critical Care Explorations. This discussion, as always, is paired with an article written by our very own columnist, Dr. Tony Fernandez, in EMS World called Journal Watch. And we encourage our listeners to check out the article at emsworld.com under the category of education and training. So thank you all for joining us. I want to remind the audience that you can use the chat feature on your screen to type in questions and comments as we go, and we'll bring those into the conversation. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Dr. Pepe, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this podcast.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure here to be here. Thank you. I'm really flattered you asked me to come talk about this paper.
Well, I think we're the ones who should be flattered. I know that there are lots of congratulations in order. I do want to congratulate you again on your Star Research Achievement Award at the Society for Critical Care Medicine. That's just fantastic.
Yeah, it was, and I was a little surprised by that, largely because this is really kind of, I don't know, attacking the sacred cow of randomized clinical trials. And so I didn't know if that would be poorly received, by the purists, but apparently it was well received, I guess, the way we did it.
Oh, well, we love some new and innovative approaches here. And now, before we dive into this really exciting and innovative study, I feel that you are a person who does not need an introduction, as your long list of contributions and achievements to EMS speaks for itself, but there may be some listeners who haven't had the pleasure of meeting you yet. Would you tell the audience a little bit about who you are and your involvement in EMS research?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I don't even know where to start. Sorry. But I guess the main thing is that I never thought of myself as ever becoming a researcher. I just want to be the best doctor I could. But as it turned out, a lot of times as you're doing things, there was a lot of conflicting information coming from different areas, and it was very hard to be able to, determine like, well, what should I do here? So sometimes I got to the point where I guess, or let's say we had a controversy with the infectious disease guys were telling us to do one antibiotic, and the pulmonary guys were saying to do another antibiotic, and so we said, well, why don't we just study which one's better? And so eventually I became actually a strong advocate for research. So I started out as a critical care guy back in Seattle in the 1970s. I was in the ICU, but I was brought to the table by the medical director for the EMS there, and for the Seattle Fire Department, Seattle Medic One program. And he actually got the impression that I was somehow think outside the box a lot. So he said, you want to be on the streets, let me know what we should do differently. So I began to really appreciate not only that it's a different work environment, but things have to be done differently, or they have to be done in a certain order. That's where we have protocols nowadays have to do with the fact that in the hospital we had so much help, but on the scene you had to do things in sort of a priority order. And the other thing I began to realize was the earlier the intervention, the better the results. Before you knew it, I kind of got suckered into doing this. I was being recruited actually to Houston in 1982 to take over the EMS system up. Well, they never had a physician director before, and they asked me to do that. There was Doctors Cooley and DeBakey, famous heart surgeons, wanting to operate on people, but they weren't making it to the hospital alive. And we had a reputation in Seattle for getting a lot of people back. So they asked me if I would do this, and I kind of agreed, because I was being asked to originally come down and run the ICUs there at their big trauma center. So I said, I'll help you out for a little while. And the next thing I know is I was just right into it. But the good news, I was able to translate a lot of the sacred cow stuff that I had been looking at back in the Seattle days and brought it to Houston. We actually did some of the first controlled clinical trials. I had learned over the years that that sometimes things seem good on the surface, but when you, one example is something called, that you may not know what it is, some of you out there, but it's called the anti-shock garment. And it was actually required by law in 2/3 of the states in 1982 to be carried on ambulances, and it was actually, you know, touted by the American College of Surgeons. Anyways, long and short of it is that they it had never been formally studied in a controlled manner. It raised blood pressure, so it seemed like a cool idea, and you didn't have to invade the body. You could just wrap it around someone and raise their blood pressure up. Well, it turned out that you had worse outcomes, and we began later to unfold it slowly but surely that if you had a bleeding patient, there may be some people that you were controlling the bleeding by a tamponade effect, like this big blood pressure cup wrapped around you. But in other cases, you were just making it worse by raising the blood pressure and sort of a toothpaste effect, and it may have been a poor thing to put on. And so we showed not only that you had to do what we call controlled clinical trials where half the people got it and half didn't, but also that that things that seem really good at first glance may not be. And it opened a whole new area of research for us where we started looking at issues like fluid resuscitation. Anyways, that could go on and on, but I became then all of a sudden like, wow, research is what it's all about, because it's true quality improvement. This is how you improve. It's like, it's a sophisticated form of quality improvement. Each day, each one of you can do quality improvement by asking the question, which antibiotic should I give? Or in your case, okay, should I give this drug or not? And the data are pretty, I mean, there's a problem with a lot of the data that are out there. We're going to talk about that much more today. And so part of it is that you can make observations on your own in individual places. Several of the research observations I made were because I actually saw patients and it gave me an idea. I asked questions, seemed like a stupid question, and but I followed up on it and I cared about patients. And I always said, if this is my family member, how would I want them treated? And that drove me to start thinking about innovations and new things. Hope I didn't go on too long, but I give you a little background, I think, right?
Oh, that's absolutely very helpful. And we very much appreciate you being on this podcast to help share your experience in resuscitation research. And our audience is probably really excited to dive into the present study. So I want to remind everyone first of the objective. And this particular study was looking at how to construct a highly detailed, practical, and attainable roadmap for enhancing the likelihood that somebody would survive cardiac arrest and survive it neurologically intact. So, Dr. Pepe, I'm curious about the background of this particular study. How was it that you all came up with this idea and decided to tackle this particular research question of making a practical and attainable roadmap?
Well, first of all, I want to make sure that you're able to hear me okay. Everything okay on the audio here?
Yep, we can hear you great. Thank you.
Talking too fast or okay?
You sound good.
All right, good. The idea behind this is that, as you heard from me, I was a zealot for doing controlled clinical trials. I helped formulate the concept of something called Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, because I said we needed to be doing this and bringing it to the streets, because that would actually determine, you know, the outcomes from different interventions. So we wanted to know would epinephrine work, would I don't know, endotracheal tube work, would whatever. And we were always approaching things in kind of an interesting fashion. Namely, we were always approaching it in the terms of an individual, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, device or intervention that we would use. And we would say, is it good or is it bad? You know, so we would test it, and half the people would get it and the other half wouldn't. The problem is that as we did these studies over the last 30 years, we had things that worked so well in the laboratory, for example, and so clear cut that when we got out into the streets, we just didn't see it working, you know, and it was like we're scratching our heads and go, what's wrong here? And it just didn't make sense. It looked like the groups were well matched. So I'll give you, if I can I give you one example maybe of a recent study that fits this situation perfectly?
Yeah, definitely.
So many of you may have heard about the impedance threshold device. Now, what that is a little kind of a valve that you put over the airway, whether you have a breathing tube in or I don't know, a advanced airway, or if you got, you know, just even bag valve device, you could use this. But it's preferred with the advanced airways. But nevertheless, what this thing does is it actually helps in terms of the downstroke of the compression. As you release, that's when air usually rushes in, and there's blood will rush into the chest as well and recoil from that vacuum you've created. But what happens, this thing holds up the airflow from coming in, so it creates more of a vacuum that helps it tug more blood into the chest. And so as a result, it not only moves blood back into the right heart, but it also does something else, which is it helps to actually increase blood flow out of the brain as well, which is kind of an interesting concept. But the thing is, right now, as we do CPR, when we do compressions, we're jettisoning blood flow both to the venous side and the arterial side. This thing helps to offshoot that by actually, during the upstroke, as you recoil, it helps to tug a little bit more blood out of the brain. And so it helps enhance circulation pretty well. So it worked really well in the laboratory, particularly in combination with some other things. So we were excited, so we decided to go out and prove that to the rest of the world, because it costs like whatever, $90, $100 a pop to use it on each cardiac arrest case. So it could be a significant amount to your budget. So what we decided to do was study it, and this was an elegant trial. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was sponsored by the NIH, not the company. It was such an elegant design that everybody got an ITD. It just was that half of them were inactivated. We didn't know which ones were inactivated or not. It was, but we had codes on it, so we would figure it out later on. So this was a truly blinded study, elegant study design, and we finished it up. And guess what? We didn't show any difference. We go, what? It didn't show any difference. It was not only not bad for you or not good for you, it just didn't show any difference. So it got published as such, and so everybody accepted that that was that. And then it was just another frustrating thing for me after having done about 7 or 8 of these kinds of studies over the years, and seeing things I knew worked so well in the laboratory setting that why wouldn't they translate to humans? Well, part of the problems is the environment and how we do these studies. So let's give you an example. If I was to tell you I did a study with AEDs at some public setting, I don't know where it was, and we did it over a couple of years, like say we used it every other day, and then in the end, it didn't make any difference in the outcome. Well, what are some of the reasons for that? It could be like the number of people studied, or it could be, I don't know, I could go on and on, a lot of other, usual scientific stuff. But I had done a study at the airport in Chicago, and we had no survivors for many years. Then when we put the AEDs in, we got back over 75% the first year. Well, it was just extraordinary. I mean, we got actually all 9 back in the first year. We had some people with the refractory VF in the second year. And so, but overall, we were just getting everybody back. So the next question was, though, when was the first shock given? And in the study that we're saying, the hypothetical, and they said, oh, well, we gave the shot, or each day shocks were given at the same time at 15 minutes or something. And you go, what? Of course it didn't work. You got to get them, you got to have it done at you got to have it done 3 or 4 minutes, the first shock. So the study was not inaccurate that they did. It was accurate. If you don't account for the time issue, then you're not going to find any difference there. So the same thing applied here at the ITD. It turned out that what we found was it was the quality of the CPR. And also there was not control for ventilation. So people were probably being overzealously ventilated in many systems, as we had found in previous studies. And in this case, only 80% of the people would have quality CPR is what I would say even liberal criteria for that. So fortunately, we had collected the data in a prospective manner. So we weren't having to do a retrospective design in a sense. I mean, we are doing let's say a follow-up study, but we were asking a totally different question of prospectively collected data. And we applied that, and what we found was that the ITD actually doubled survival rates if you were doing good CPR. And it was, the other thing was, it wasn't that you were doing good CPR, but it was highly dependent to be in a very, very tight range of rate and death. And if you get into that, it did tremendously better. And so it's not that the ITD wasn't good or bad. It was just that if you don't account for CPR and a lot of other variables, then it's not going to make any difference in your outcome. And so that's a good example of that. There are so many what we call confounding variables, or things that affect your outcomes, that you really, we now are recognizing it's impossible to get studies done where we're doing a binary equation. So the background on all this was to say, is there an alternative to doing the controlled trial? Because it works so well in so many other areas and it works in the laboratory, but it ain't working out here because there's so many variables. Time, did they get good bystander CPR or not? Because the interventions will change according to what, interventions will necessarily change according to various other interventions. For example, ventilation affects CPR, or CPR with the ITD, the rates and death might change, or whatever. So everything is interactive and affects each other. It's hard to control for all those variables out in that setting. So therefore, we said, what's the alternative? So that leads us up to where we are now. I hope I didn't get on too long. Is that about right timing that you want for these answers?
Yeah, absolutely. I love listening to these answers, and you've hit on a lot of really important points here. And it's something we actually talk about on this podcast a great deal: is how important is the setting where a study is conducted. And we actually have talked about this randomized control trial that was done to see if parachutes work or not. And you know what? They found that there was no difference the parachute between wearing a parachute and not wearing a parachute and jumping out of an airplane. And why did they find no difference? Well, because the airplane was on the ground, not a real world setting. And I think one of the really big strengths of this study that we're looking at today is that it occurred within real systems in real world settings. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony Fernandez. I know he has a couple of questions regarding the methods and how the study was set up that he would like to ask you about.
Yeah, and if I can interrupt for a second, I do want to put into perspective is that the New England Journal paper and that study was, based on what you just said, entirely accurate. That if you don't account for all those variables and control for CPR, control for ventilation, control for all the other factors, timing, et cetera, and how you do it, so many other factors, that's an accurate study. I mean, it's correct. But it doesn't mean that the ITD did not work. It's not that it's good or bad. And as I'm trying to think back in Star Wars, right, when Obi-Wan Kenobi says to Anakin that only a Sith deals in absolutes, and that's an important point you brought out. You got to know the context. So thanks very much for bringing that up, Remley. Okay, well, let's go ahead, Tony.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pepe, really for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And talking about the study that we're going to review today, this was, I think, a really interesting study that's really going to add to the literature. And this was a multidisciplinary collaboration. And this was a group called the International Resuscitation Collaborative, or IRC. Could you tell us a little more about this group and maybe how it came together for this project?
Well, yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. It was, to some extent, it was a bunch of people that were just really good people who were in the trenches type of folks who also did research. And it actually mixed together like EMS chiefs who had been successful in improving outcomes in their systems, leading scientists who are the cutting edge of, whether it's in-hospital resuscitation or out-of-hospital resuscitation. And they were from many parts of the United States and also many parts of Europe as well, largely. There were some other countries involved, but largely Europe and US. And we actually had some of our first meetings over in that foreign country of California, right? And no, seriously, we had first meeting was in Oakland. I had a follow-up meeting in Paris, and all these researchers came together, and we came up and said, we've got to figure out a strategy for improving outcomes and get the message out, because it's just not working with the current guidelines that are out there. So these were just, I don't know, it just was a kindred spirits that decided to get together. These are all respected researchers who had been, chairs of the American Heart Association science committees. They had been the head of the European Resuscitation Council, and so on. So there was, I could go on and talk about them, but there were also some people who were just very intrepid medical directors that were out there making a difference.
Very interesting. And so you looked at best practices for some high-performing systems, and there were 10 systems. Can you tell us a little bit about these systems and how and why they were included?
Well, obviously, all of us kind of keep up on the literature, but also all of us are talking to each other and on a regular basis, not just at some meetings every 5 years, and so on. And so I'm very fortunate to host and coordinate a group of people called the jurisdictional, well, they're the jurisdictional medical directors of the 911 systems for 50 or 60 of the largest cities in the United States, plus their counterparts in Europe, like London, Paris, Berlin, Milan, etc. And we get on the phone. We're actually on Zoom calls every week talking to each other. So people are picking up whatever's going on in their area, or new technologies, or we have new things presented to us. And then when we hear about it, they may tell us that some system was using it, did really well with it, a smaller system where they can control things. So we make communications through that. So we just began to ascertain, and at scientific meetings, we would show up and see people presenting stuff where they were introducing new technologies or new approaches. And we were impressed. We were going, wow, that's a pretty good outcome. And so we gathered some information. A bunch of us got together and said, who's out there doing really cool stuff with new innovations or new approaches, and not just sticking to the standards. And we decided to limit it to 10, so it wouldn't get too crazy. But we picked 10 systems that seem to be doing much better than others, and we wanted to scrutinize that to see, is that really true, or is it them just claiming to be better?
That's great, and I really want to get into how you scrutinize these systems. So these systems, they often use their historical controls for cardiac arrest data as their individual communities. But you did something a little different, and I thought it was really interesting. Can you tell us more about your measures and the CARES database and where the data came from for your assessments?
Well, we were really more concerned about that if the individual cities did much better than they are doing in general, or they were before. We looked at it as a quality assurance approach, and it was an excellent quality assurance approach. So for example, let's say they introduced one of these devices for the public where they know where an AED is located, or they could be contacted about CPR. Or let's say a community had introduced a mobile ECMO program, or someplace had introduced whatever, and they showed definitive improvement, then we wanted to look at that. That would be good. See, in the past, when we wanted to do a controlled clinical trial, like we did with the ROC, the Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium, this would require going through institutional review boards. It would require going through a lot of training, a lot of things, funding sources, and government grants, and it just got very, very complicated, and no one could probably spend more time doing the setup than you did in actually getting it going, and the amount of money that was spent on it was significantly. So what happened here is as a community introduced a new innovation, and we were always made sure they were FDA approved, and they had to also present it. I'm sorry about the background noise there. Hang out for 1 second. I'm in a military base. Yeah, we had military planes flying over. Sorry about that. And so we wanted to make sure that that what they were telling us was accurate in the context, and so we actually had them present. The people that were invited were asked to present the papers, and we required that they had at least have presented a scientific paper, a scientific meeting, and the papers had been presented there and scrutinized by others. And so we scrutinized it. What we did is we got our 30 or so scientists sitting down and had each group present what they had done and how they had gotten improvement. So what was nice is that they were doing a quality improvement project. There was nothing in terms of, let's say, creating any kind of human subjects risk there from that point of view. And they were just saying something as simple as, if I get this thing on sooner, does it work better? You know, and that's exactly it. So they would develop things like, oh, I don't know, you could get a Lucas device on in 4 seconds, and they developed drills to show us, videos to show us how to do that and how to drill for it to get that done right. So it helps you at the scene. So there was things like that went on. So it was more than just it's more than devices being used, but how they were used and how they were implemented. And I think that's what was really striking. So what we did is we had each person present their thing, and then we did different aspects of their systems, 911 systems, the citizens response, what we did at the hospital, the communications with the hospital, what their hospitals were doing. Did they have resuscitation centers that they could take to that had they established those in their system? So we actually did those inventories of each system, and we looked to see who had the same thing of these systems that have been performing so well with their quality improvement projects. And lo and behold, we found a lot of striking similarities across the board. And more importantly, some of the places that were beginning to do even better were introducing even new things that we all decided as a group, well, let's all do this next. And we will recommend that as part of the roadmap. But what about was not that epi work or endotracheal intubation work or anything work. It was more of a bundle of care that was tailored not only in terms of what you did and what you brought to the table, but how you used it, how you trained in it, how you quality assured it. And that's what was really cool, I think, about this, because we came up with something that everybody felt like, this is cool, I'm taking this back to my system, right? Or this is the one thing I'm not doing, that may be what I need. For example, we learned in the laboratory that that head-up CPR, for example, works really well, but it works really well if it's in combination with like an active compression decompression pump and the ITD. Each one of those things have different mechanisms for pulling blood out of the brain and lowering intracranial pressure, but put together, they weren't additive, they were synergistic. And that's what was really kind of cool. And this is not a new concept. I mean, you go back to the concept, there's a paper I wrote back in, I think, 1991, based on something I wrote to City Council in 1992 called the chain, in Houston, called the Chain of Survival paper. And, and actually, I don't, even though I did that, I don't take the full credit because I had heard it from Peter Saffer, who had heard it from one of his friends back in 1968 in Germany. And the Rettungskette, as they call it. And so, but the point was is that all those links in the chain of survival had to be present, or you didn't have optimal outcomes. And so it's not a new concept to have the bundle. Everything is interdependent, has to be there, and something as simple as the chain of survival has now become 20 times more complicated in terms of not only all these multiple interventions in multiple sites, but also how you bring them all together. So you could probably guess what the key ingredient is going to be in that in just a few seconds. But I'm sorry, I should pitch back to you, Tony. Go ahead.
Oh no, I think that was an excellent discussion. I think you've given us a great background in the discussion of the methods. I think we might be ready to roll into your results.
Yeah, so what was interesting is that the results were essentially that we created the roadmap that everybody was happy with. And unlike a lot of meetings I go to, there was very little contention here. It was fascinating. These are very bright people who are pragmatic, and maybe because they were like-minded in that, let's not get stuck in the quagmire or worry about what the standards are there. Let's go out there and honor those standards, but let's see if we can take it to the next level with the intention of taking care of the public, particularly in this disease process that has very low survival rates. So one of the things we did, we packaged those things together. We were kind of happy. Everybody agreed, yeah. I disagreed kind of with this point, but if we make it an option, we could probably do it that way. Also, some places can't afford all this, so maybe we ought to tell them how much they think it's going to cost. And we developed, for example, annualized budgets for them that it turned out if you ran an ambulance and it cost you $500,000 to $1 million a year, this is only an additional increment of about, I don't know, $14,000, annualized over several years, as you say. And that includes the 12-lead EKG. I mean, so which we all carry anyways. So the point was there wasn't that much of an incremental additional cost, so we thought we'd tell them that. So those additional results we gave to them. And then we also, the secondary results were to put together what we thought many of us were missing that some places had implemented, such as ECMO systems, or let's say the use of device-assisted controlled sequential elevation of the head, and they were showing really promising results there. So we decided to report all those things, et cetera, put together. So that was the real, I think, results of this. And here's the basic principle behind that. The basic principle is that when I really think back to my original days in the laboratory, because that's what was one of the requirements I had when I was a critical care fellow, was that I was excited to call my professor and say, hey, the experiment worked. We had better outcomes. It was really cool. And he just sort of laughed and sort of in a very, in funny sage-like mode and said, look, he goes, it's not successful yet. And I go, why is that? He goes, well, you need to be able to reproduce these results somewhere else. You need to be able to write up exactly how you did it. You have to write the recipe up just exactly right, you know, the method, so that anybody could reproduce it and they know exactly what you're saying and they can reproduce exactly the same manner. And now, if you can do that successfully and you get out to other laboratories and those other laboratories can reproduce it and they do it successfully, they don't show that no difference, they show that they could, then you're successful, because now you've made groundwork, you've done it. So that was the principle behind here, is that if we could reproduce the results elsewhere and we can document that it did, we had to give them a good roadmap for doing it. But some of it's subtle, like for example, how to apply a device, etc. And that was one of the things that we came to in our conclusions there. And here it was, all these cities were using these very similar new innovations and techniques, and that's why they got these better outcomes. So we think we were on the right road in terms of the reproducibility model for using this roadmap. Now, I think what you're also leading to is that were the outcomes in these cities really better than the rest? So we looked to something that would be a respected standard out there, and so we looked at the CARES registry, and I think most of you know the cardiac arrest registry, and I can't remember what the rest of the acronym stands for, but a fantastic thing developed by Emory and CDC. And many cities across the country have now adopted this to monitor their outcomes and have a good registry. And what we've shown is that when you do such a thing, you actually improve your outcomes just because you're looking at it now. And so what's kind of cool about the registry is it probably gives you the best available data. I mean, data are probably a lot worse in the cities that are not reporting it or not looking at it. And so this was kind of the best available data out there. And our model cities that we had picked, the EMS 10 as we called them, had statistically significant, I mean dramatically different in some situations, like witnessed arrests with ventricular fibrillation, and who got bystander CPR. I mean, it was just major improvements in outcome in those cities. And so, and that could translate into literally tens of thousands of lives being saved every year across the United States, and people had adopted what they had done. So that's, I think, was a reasonable thing to do. It wasn't the result of the study. It just was, we did it as a reference point for everybody else. And I hope that explains it.
It certainly does. And one of the things that I'm taking away from this study is, it's a phrase I've heard in a couple of different places, including Seattle and in Europe. It's this concept of it takes a system to save a life. And so focusing on one single intervention rarely is going to lead to this silver bullet that we're all looking for. And instead, we've got to be focusing on the interactions and the synergies between different components in the system. And so I think figure 1 does a really good job at highlighting that. We have the elements that are part of that bundle of care, which consists of community response, the first responder and basic life support, advanced life support, and then of course the in-hospital care. And I really like the element at the top that talks about the importance of even having something like an annual survivor event, to celebrate those who have survived cardiac arrest. Now, one thing that you mentioned earlier in this podcast, and I wanted to take a moment to highlight some of these best practices that were found in the high-performing EMS systems. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about some of these words we mentioned, like active compression, decompression, and heads-up CPR.
Sure. And I hate to focus on just that because it was because they're just very small components, but critical components, as it turns out, to make a difference. But I think I alluded to this before. When I talked about the impedance threshold device, it enhances sort of the vacuum in the chest on the decompression phase. And the idea for that actually came from a thing that happened in the 1990s in San Francisco, where somebody used a toilet plunger to save, it was a plumber whose kid saved his life by putting the toilet plunger on his chest and moving it up and down. And you think about it, not only were you compressing, like we like to do to get the blood out of, particularly on the arterial side, even though it goes both ways, but what happens then on the upstroke, it's sucking up, it's creating more of a vacuum. So again, by creating that, the intrathoracic pressure going negatively, creating a vacuum, not just going back to neutral position, you're pulling more blood into the chest and pulling it out of the brain quite literally. So even if you get compressions, that set the pressure waves up both the arterial and venous side. Now at least you're on the upstroke, you're pulling that blood out, and so that creates a greater pathway for the arterial blood to go in. It lowers intracranial pressure. So the active compression decompression device, like the toilet plunger, basically is able to give you compressions and then decompressions and vacuuming more blood into the chest, and just like you did with the ITD, but it did in a different manner. Now the head-up CPR by itself really doesn't work that well, and it actually can be harmful if you do it too early. But we have found is that you now start elevating the head, I don't know, 10%, 20% angle, a little bit at a time over 2 or 3 minutes after you put the ITD and active compression decompression device on. It will give you much better outcomes. We're actually now seeing clinically, I mean, in the laboratory, we're seeing dramatic increases. We're getting people back to normal perfusion pressures, cerebral perfusion pressures. The animals were doing much better. And now we're seeing in the field, and I could cite you, we're just starting to get it out there, and I could cite you lots of anecdotes where the researchers have had to get protocols now for sedation because these people were waking up while they're in ventricular fibrillation. They're in refractory AFib, going in to go to ECMO, and they're getting this combination of head up, active decompression, and ITD, and they're getting like really good perfusion. The end-tidal CO2s are normalized in over 80% of them. So they're actually, some of them are beginning to wake up on the way to the hospital. So it's pretty impressive that we're going in the right direction here. And it's been reproduced now in several cities around the country with the same kind of results. But then again, we're quality assuring that, and we find that if you get it done within 10 minutes of the 911 call, the outcomes are dramatically better. And then they're just incrementally better if it's, like, say, more than 10 minutes, et cetera. Now, that's intuitive, but we've documented it with our quality assurance. And that's why all this has to be examined carefully, methodically, and not just done. It's how you do it. What did I say before? It's not just the device or the technology, it's how you do it and how it's integrated with all the other things. So, for example, let's say I don't know, let's take the CPR, the rate and depth. Well, the rate and depth might vary if you start using these other devices that enhance flow. So you've got to keep in mind that these are all interactive, and that giving a positive pressure breath too often will negate the effect of all this stuff. So it really has to be a complete bundle of care, not only on the streets, but also in the hospital. If the hospital drops the ball and doesn't do all these things, if they're not a resuscitation center, then it may not work very well. And again, you may not be able to have all those things in the areas where you live, but you have to do your best to make sure most of those things are optimized as best as they can within your system in those circumstances. Remley, did I hit on what you wanted me to say there?
You absolutely do. And I'm going to turn it to another panelist who has a question. Dave Page, I believe you wanted to ask something.
Thank you, Dr. Pepe. I'm a big fan of your work. Thank you for your contributions. And I'll declare full conflict because I live and work in Minnesota. I work for Alina, and we use a bundle of care. And so I'm a big fan. So, but I do want to ask you, just in terms of the, for those people listening that are thinking, oh, how would I do research and look at these big complex resuscitation outcome trials that then show no difference, and the key story to me in that ITD study was no difference. But then when we did the secondary analysis and look at, well, we were doing compressions really badly. And when we take out the cases that have compression fraction done poorly, then suddenly the ITD looks like it doubles, resuscitation outcomes, positive outcomes. So I think there was a lot of criticism on doing these secondary analyses, and the purists would say, well, you didn't discover that on the first pass. But then, the pragmatist in me says, well, yeah, but we didn't know that CPR was being done that poorly, and when you take those out, it matters. How do you defend against that concept that the secondary analysis is published in a journal that's not as prominent as maybe the first study is, and how tell us your thoughts about those secondary analyses?
Oh. Well, actually, I feel very comfortable, as I explained before, because I'm no one can argue that I was the strongest zealot of making sure we were doing randomized controlled trials, but I learned my lesson on that. So I kind of turn around and say, okay, well then do it better. And everything, again, these are people who are probably taught in some school how to do research a certain way, and retrospective studies are bad or whatever it may be. And the thing here is that we went and asked, because the issue, we were changing CPR standards at that time, we said, I wonder if this affected it at all. So we were asking a totally different question, and we applied it to data that were collected prospectively, all that, and we had all the information, including the recordings of the CPR, so we could actually directly look at that. So it's not like we were just sort of, data dredging. This was a true scientific study in itself. And actually, the reason why I published in Critical Care Explorations, I didn't even bother to go back to some like the New England Journal, because of where is that going to? And they found the same things in critical care medicine over the years because of the small number of patients that they have to treat. And so they really were encouraging this. And the editor there and I were good friends, and he said, look, he goes, this is exactly what we need in critical care explorations, because you're exploring a whole new territory, and we got to get this out here. And then finally, I have been, over the years, even if I had something published in the New England Journal of Medicine in the past, I'd have the naysayers out there saying, whatever, there was just all sorts of criticisms about it and so on. And then it turns out that what I found 30 years later was, for example, the IV fluid study, that we showed that you had worse outcomes if you gave IV fluids to penetrating injury patients if you hadn't controlled bleeding yet. Now we know why, and we now know the reasons for that. But I've been a patient person. I've seen that it sometimes takes 20 or 30 years for people to adapt or rediscover some of this stuff that we were intrepid enough to try to challenge. And that's what this is about. I'm back doing what I did back in Seattle, going back to doing what I did in Houston, is challenging the sacred cow and come up with a better practical tool, but not overstate the value for it, or not say it's better than randomized clinical trials. It's just that they're not practical in the hospital setting, and here's our alternative. So I always say that anybody who's a naysayer is that could just throw out a little clip like that say, well, you show me how you could do it better, because we're making progress and we're saving lives.
And that is
Fantastic.
excellent.
Thank you. Yeah, great.
And I don't know
Now,
if Remily, do you want me to add into the audience there? I'm not sure who all is out there today, but welcome. Thank you for having me here. It's my real privilege. And the thing is, remember, I started off like all of you, was out there just wanting to be the best, in my case, best doctor and best critical care doctor I could be. But I observed things, and like the IV fluid study came up because I saw what happened to a person that we gave IV fluids to after we had his arm cut off, and he wasn't bleeding anymore, probably was all spasmed off. As soon as we raised the blood pressure, I go, that's interesting. I wonder if that happens to other people, because I was lucky enough that not only was a dumbfounded discovery, but I had dumb luck, and that a case across the hall came in with a stabbing to the belly. And I was getting ready to give the same orders to give IV fluids for this guy with a blood pressure of 90, but he didn't look too bad, but I still, he was drunk and so on. But I said, well, let's get an IV in and give him the fluid. And then I spun around and said, I wonder if the same thing happens to him that happened in the other room. We followed it up, and that's the whole point, is that anybody can make game-changing events, so even yourself out there, any of you, if you just observe and follow through on it and just continue to observe it. Take notes, ask people, and then choose mentors who really are willing to go the extra mile. And I think those are the main secrets I had going for me.
If I could jump in for a second, first of all, such an honor to be on the same panel with you, Dr. Pepe, and thank you so much for sharing this excellent study. And as you just said, we all want to be the best provider that we can. But I think what this study showed is that it's not just about that singular provider or even that singular EMS agency, but it's really this entire bundle of care. And I know personally, and many of my coworkers, we can often get a little bit distracted about fancy devices like a Lucas or impedance threshold device. Can you talk a little bit more about the basics, like dispatch-assisted CPR, bystander CPR, those elements of the community response, and then more of the basic BLS measures and how they factor into this bundle of care and their relative importance?
Okay, well, some of that answer is pretty easy in the sense that, you know, if you think is what they taught me when I was learning on the streets of Seattle back in the 70s, and what I brought to Houston when I did the Chain of Survival, you know, presentation for City Council. I said that we could get there rapidly and have the best paramedics on the planet and the best hospitals, but if no one's buying us time with bystander CPR, it ain't gonna make it. So you've got to make sure that that's a requirement, that everybody in your entire community is trained in CPR. When I left Seattle, we had, I think I half the times when I arrived on scene, there were citizens, plural, doing CPR, usually 2 family members. And so it really, it's critical. So that's just sort of taken for granted. But let's even take it to the level, can we get someone who could come and do CPR? Because in the cases I thought were going to be keepers, in Seattle, they weren't, because, yeah, there was someone doing CPR, but it had been a nurse from across the street, and they went and got her, and then they came back, and by the time she started doing the CPR, it was kind of too late. We needed everybody to be doing it in that community, and we needed to alert people that it was going on. And there's so many more citizens now that know CPR, know what to do. We have AEDs everywhere, so all that stuff's got to be in the bundle. The dispatchers need to know what to do and go right to it, like the no-go protocols or whatever. So I can go on and on. But it's interesting that you bring up what you just said about the basic life support. We're now thinking about using things like the Lucas and the ITD even, or the active compression decompression, as a basic life support device, because you don't have to invade somebody. So even if you text this heavy-duty technology, and I don't mean heavy because we turned out it wasn't that bad, but in terms of just really, you know, innovative new technology like the device-assisted controlled sequential elevation, what we found out is that that's probably a BLS tool, because the sooner we get it on, the better off it is. And so it doesn't have to be managed by paramedics. And a lot of the new technologies can be handled by the citizens, as we discussed before, and a lot of the new technologies can be handled by the dispatchers, and a lot of the new technologies can be handled by the first responder firefighters, for example, or police officers, whatever it is in your community. So I think from that point of view, I think your emphasis on basic life support is truly critical. And one of the things about having the machines, I think that's really cool about having the machines, is that it may make sure you're getting quality of CPR. And so therefore have your end-tidal CO2s there guiding you, or whatever it may be, to make sure that you're doing everything right. And so, yes, it may involve more technology, but now we know where to place that technology. It may not have to be all with just paramedics. It can be with first responders.
That's an excellent overview of that. And I feel like it's a good time to bring in a question that we have from one of our audience members. Luis asks about what's the role of high performance CPR programs in the context of this paper. And he says that it makes sense to view this in terms of a bundle of elements, but there's been this big push recently on high performance CPR. And could this be something that's distracting us from the overall larger picture?
No, I don't know if it's a distraction, and I don't want to sound, you know, I don't know what the right word is, but I mean, my bosses were in Dr. Kopis and Dr. Cobb, my medical directors in Seattle, were telling me to focus on performing CPR well, and it was just duh. And I go back and even look at the Rescue 911 videos that I did, and my people are doing really good quality CPR, high performance. And so it's nothing new. It's just that somehow it's gotten lost in our training, or maybe it wasn't focused. But I really love the new programs that are going around, and I'm not selling any products like, you know, that CQI CPR, but, you know, any place where you get feedback. I remember the first time I got on a compression dummy with the feedback loops, and, you know, and I thought I was doing pretty good CPR, and then it said slow down. And then so I slowed down, and then it said push deeper. And I realized that I was just not pushing as hard when I slowed down. So I had to learn to go, okay, deeper but slower. And I started getting a new, you know, muscle memory coming out thanks to the feedback loops. And so I think those things are really that are improving things even more so. And so we try to, in all these high performing systems that we saw, that we recorded, that was part of it all. Having end-tidal CO2 monitors to tell you that you're getting over 30 or 40 millimeters of mercury, having the feedback loops to say slow down or speed up or control how much breaths you're giving and making sure you're giving the right depth of breathing and not doing it too often. And so all those things are now technological feedback loops, and I hope they'll get better. And recently, I think that brings up a good point. You brought up before from the Alina system, several of the cities up in that region had developed little packages for carrying this stuff, and it makes it a lot more. You don't need Sherpas. It just makes it more efficient, and you get the stuff out faster. And again, it's not just the feedback loop. It's not just the device. It's not just the performance of CPR. It's about, in the high performance CPR or the training for it or actually doing it on scene. It's all about how you implement it. So you're absolutely in the right context. Remember, the ITD doesn't work without high performance CPR. So there you go.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And I know one of our panelists has a remaining question, so I'll turn it over to Dr. Bill Toon.
Again, I want to echo what everyone else says. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us and share your vast experience and knowledge on this paper and everything. So it would be interesting to me to know, and I know your data here doesn't answer the question because how it's aggregated, but it would be very interesting to know how many people had ROSC prior to the full bundle being applied. And then did the full bundle then just add a few more people to the overall survival? And, just again, if a system was to start from scratch and collect their current data to know what their baseline is, if they just, but I think also knowing when ROSC happens. And again, I take from my past experience of maintaining a registry for a county system that we found our ROSC, the majority of them happened long before we did anything significant in the sense of medications or going beyond 10 minutes or anything like that. And those were the people that had the absolute best outcome. Thoughts?
Yeah, so I agree with you 100% because the people who were most apt to live or got really good quality CPR, they might even been gasping by the time anybody got there with an AED, shocked them, and they woke up. They didn't need intubation. They didn't need epi. They didn't need anything else. But we have now enough data from those systems to show that with patients presented in asystole or even with PEA or whatever, but let's just say asystole, we found out we were able to get back dramatic elevations in ROSC. And a classic one was in the Palm Beach County study that came out a couple of years ago about introducing head-up CPR. It wasn't even an optimal approach to it, but they added all three components in there: the head-up with good quality CPR, Lucas device, and the ITD. And what they found was that they brought their ROSC rate for, say, the asystole patients from 13% up to like 31%. And then later, when they added in the device-assisted elevation of the head and thorax alone, they drove it up to around 40% for just the asystole subgroup. So, in a certain percentage of those did go home, not as many. The people that do go home, of course, are the ones who did present with ventricular fibrillation. But even if you look at the subgroup of refractory ventricular fibrillation, when you have them waking up on the way to the hospital to get the ECMO, and then they walk home, a week later, it's pretty impressive. So even the anecdotes fly there, and I think you're right that there may have been a few of those cases, but I think the data and collecting the information is what it's all about, by the way, and you know that, as you just mentioned. It will demonstrate that it's more than just the ROSC rate returning ahead of time.
Absolutely. And it pains me to say we are in our last 3 minutes of this podcast. The time has just flown by. And again, really greatly appreciate your time here. I'm going to feed back a couple of the key things I took away from the last few pieces of this discussion. And so a key piece for me is that these high performer results don't seem to happen just by accident. It takes a really focused approach. And there's probably a lot of training that goes along with this in surveillance. And most importantly, that we shouldn't just be viewing things as good or bad and within a vacuum as isolated procedures. And so with that, I'm going to give you the last word, Dr. Pepe. Are there any key takeaways or pieces of advice that I missed that you would like to share with our audience before we go?
No, but I think you bring up a good point that we really have to drill down on that. And first of all, I'd be glad to come back, and there's so many other things I could go over with you. I'd be glad to come back anytime. And so thank you. First of all, I'm flattered to be here in the first place. But one of the things, as I point out near the end, that you got things unseen faster and you had better outcomes if you had developed kits to help get it there. Or if you did a training video that allows you to show people how to get on a Lucas device in 4 seconds. Or if you created a system to make sure that all the various elements are cooked together, or you've hooked in the population as a whole. The point is that what this really requires are these incredibly good leaders, the zealots themselves, in terms of making sure the community is involved, the dispatch is involved, the hospitals are involved. So as Oscar Wilde once said, it's personalities, not principles, that move the age. And I think that may be the secret ingredient that we need to remember at all times.
That's a great secret ingredient. And so again, this study does such a great job at illustrating how it takes a system to save a life. And I want to thank you once more for taking the time to share your experience with us and your dedication to high quality, practical EMS research that happens in real world settings. And with that, I do have to end us abruptly here. So as a reminder for our audience, we have the Education Research Journal Club podcast on Friday, February 26th, and we'll be back here with the clinical podcast the second Monday of the month, which will be March 8th. So thank everyone for listening and look forward to being here with you next time.